I'm with Tanvi Madan, the head of the India section at Brookings Institution, a think tank in Washington, D.C., Shashank Joshi, the defense editor of The Economist in London, and Zorawar Daleep Singh, well-known commentator of international affairs. He's also written a book called Power Shift. And today, of course, we're discussing the traffic jam in Delhi lately. These last 72 hours or so, several world leaders have come to Delhi. The latest is the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. He left Delhi on a Friday evening. He was here. He met the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. In fact, perhaps the only leader to have met the Prime Minister these last few days, Liz Truss, the British Foreign Secretary, was here. And of course, Daleep Singh, the US Deputy National Editor for International Economics. So I'm joining the time zones, and let me welcome you all to The Print. Tanvi and Zorawar and Shashank, welcome.
Very good to be here.
Tanvi, first to you. You're in DC. Now, Daleep Singh, the US Deputy National Security Advisor, has made a lot of waves in India recently. With his comments, he said that India will have to face consequences if it goes ahead with buying oil. He didn't specifically mention oil, but if it improves its relationship with Russia, considering that Russia has invaded Ukraine, it's been a month in the war. Your first comments on his comments in India.
So to me, this was a little bit of a messaging issue more than a substance issue, because what he actually said, and as you know, Jyoti, I have said that I don't think it is ever helpful and it's even counterproductive to go to India and say anything that can be interpreted as US warns India. But I will say, if you look at the actual comments, which are available beyond the headlines, they were actually quite interesting, because what did they say? It actually left India a lot of space. It said, just don't accelerate it speedily. Now, that's not going to happen anyway for various reasons. India doesn't buy that much oil from Russia in the first place, even if India increases it a certain amount. There are actually restrictions in terms of not in terms of sanctions or anything. There are reasons India doesn't buy that much oil from Russia in the first place. Those won't go away overnight. It is also, you can get a discount. But for example, there's still freight costs and things. So setting that aside, to me, with his statements, you saw him actually say, if there's sanction evasion, there will be a problem. Now, I wish
there are no sanctions, as we know, on Russia selling oil. But I think look at his phrase. He says, yes, there will be consequences to countries that actively attempt to circumvent or backfill the sanctions. Yes. And today, Lavrov made it very clear that he's willing to sell not just deeply discounted oil, but also other technologies and armaments to India. So what does that do to the India-US relationship?
It will look. Differences on Russia aren't new in the US-India relationship, as you know, right? We've been thinking about CAATSA for a while. This actually goes back even to the Cold War. These are not new. They're going to be managed, and if they're not managed, it will hinder the US-India relationship.
Would you agree that Daleep Singh's comments were, he was sort of tone deaf? I mean, he's the great grandson of Daleep Singh's son, who's
look. Can I tell you something? One of the things, Jyoti. He is the Deputy National Security Advisor of the United States.
Sure.
It doesn't matter whose grandson is he, whether he's young, whether he's Indian American. I've seen a lot of commentary about that. If we're going to disagree with him and say his messaging was bad, and I said it on Twitter, I wish he hadn't messaged it this way, because it actually takes away from the conversation, which is him being there to try to find ways to create options for India. Mm-hmm. And so to me, the messaging, yes, but it is him as a Deputy National Security Advisor. I wish we wouldn't get into this thing of, oh, he's young, oh, he's Indian American. That's besides the point. Okay. After all, there are lots of people who we know who, are older.
Are young and Indian American, absolutely. So Shashank, can I come to you? Liz Truss, the British Foreign Secretary, was in India. She had a well-publicized meeting with the External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, did not say what Daleep Singh has said, did not say that I'm not going to tell India not to buy oil from Russia or not to tell India what to do, but basically had the same message, which is that India has to be much more critical of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Well, she didn't say that, of course, and she's learnt precisely the same lesson that Tanvi was alluding to, which is, successive British officials have learned sometimes the hard way that you don't go to India and issue statements in that way because Tanvi said it's counterproductive. So, if you look at very carefully what she said, there was again that exquisitely sort of self-restraint. In that, obviously, it is staggeringly obvious to anyone watching this conflict that the West, the US, the UK, European countries want to peel Russia's allies away from it to the extent that they can on this issue and on other issues. That's unsurprising. This is an issue of such profound import for us in Europe. For us, it's such a substantial change to the status quo. Of course, that there'll be an effort to do that, but the messaging is very clear. She said, "I'm not going to tell India what to do," and I think for the same reason she realizes that India is going to look after its interests. India is going to sort of have these constraints, and that the direction of change in India's Russia policy is still noticeable. Because, I certainly, remember 2014, and there are important differences in the approach today that reflect that shift as well. Mm-hmm. And I think we've focused a great deal on oil, on the rupee-ruble trading mechanisms and all of these things. Yeah, I think this is a much bigger issue than that. And there's also thinking not just on what will India say on Ukraine. Will it mention Russia? Will it talk about the war? Will it criticize or not criticize publicly? I think that stuff isn't as significant as some of the longer term issues we're grappling with, including, for example, on alignment between India and Russia on other issues, space security, cybersecurity, UN votes, international.
Yeah, but I think right now we are focused on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that's why all these leaders are in Delhi. Otherwise, they won't be in Delhi. So, Zorawar, the question to you is, why is it that Prime Minister Modi has met the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov when he didn't meet the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss or the German NSA or the Dutch NSA? Why do you think he met Mr. Lavrov?
Yeah, well, Jyoti, it's clear, isn't it, that since this outbreak of the conflict, India hasn't gone along with the views of Washington or Brussels or European capitals. I think it's looked at this very differently. Regardless of how the UN votes, I think there is an element where India recognizes just how important Russia will be to this emerging world order, as it has been in the past. And I think it's trying to secure that relationship. And everything else is, in a sense, natural, as was alluded to. The West has always had this absolutist, universal outlook on international affairs, and you're either with us or against us. And India has never bought into that. So I think you're seeing India follow a far more natural orientation and is part of a long history of approaching these kinds of major great power conflicts or proxy conflicts as we're seeing here. And it's basically securing the Russia relationship. And it is significant, of course, isn't it, that the Prime Minister met the Foreign Minister. Looking forward, I think what we have to now see is come to the substance. Is India going to ensure that it secures those supply chains of defense, energy, FDI, and other high-tech engagement with Russia? I think it will. But that's where I think the United States would like to sort of alter India's course. Let's see. I don't think they'll succeed, but they're going to keep trying.
Tanvi, the same question to you. Why do you think the Prime Minister met the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, and not, say, the British Foreign Secretary?
Well, as you know, Jyoti, usually, in fact, it's something that prime ministers don't do. In fact, last year, I think it was almost exactly a year ago that Sergei Lavrov was in India and didn't get a meeting with the prime minister, whereas I think it was John Kerry or somebody who was visiting who did. And so, yes, obviously, it's a signal. To me, the question is, and we often don't get readouts from PMO meetings, but it would be interesting to know what he said, what is said in that meeting. We've got the readout from the foreign ministry. Is what is said in that meeting. I think it is a signal, Zoravar's right. But I also think there is another...
What is the signal for? What is the signal about?
Look, I think the signal is that India is not going to give up its relationship with Russia. But we've also heard the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister say very clearly, and while they might not be taking Washington or Brussels' view, they're also not taking Moscow's view. This is kind of India taking its own path. And it is good for Sergei Lavrov to hear directly from the Prime Minister himself. So he doesn't think this is only coming from MEA, that India has a problem with the violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty of any countries, and with kind of disputes being resolved through force and not dialogue. So he should also get a message, and he probably did, directly from the Prime Minister, that look, we're not giving up our relationship with you. We are not, condemning you, but these are our interests. To me, it was also interesting to see in the Foreign Ministry readout the mention of not just kind of the international law aspects, but the signal that, look, for economic and other ties to be maintained, you need stability. All these talks, Lavrov can offer whatever Russia wants, but at the end of the day, two things are true, right? It's actually harder to diversify the India-Russia relationship in the way that both countries have been talking about because of the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And second, India and Russia will, maintain a relationship, but that trajectory has not been affected by the US in the last 10 years. Trajectory has been affected partly by Russia's decisions, for example, to align with China, to partner also with Pakistan. That is affecting the trajectory more than anything the US is going to tell India to do.
Right. So hold your thought on the China-Pakistan axis. Shashank, I'd like to come to you. Why was Liz Truss in Delhi? What did she come here to do?
Well, in the first instance, I imagine, as I said at the beginning, the fundamental interest is in trying to limit that degree of India-Russia alignment, right?
Why?
Well, because it's a strategic aim for the West as a whole to try and secure as much support it can for its position, which is that it wants to see Russia pay a cost diplomatically, economically, militarily, in every sense, for the invasion of Ukraine. And so it's going to go to the Western allies, NATO, European countries, and that's going to stretch to independent-minded countries, including those close to Russia. And that includes not just India, it'll also include countries like South Africa, like Brazil, like Mexico, many of those other countries, to try and get as much daylight as possible between Russia and its partners. But as I said at the beginning, there's a realistic sense of how far that process will go, right? Everyone understands we're not going to get these countries standing up condemning Russia. There's a realistic sense that's not going to happen.
Okay. But, we heard yesterday in the meeting between External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, Liz Truss, this is the Indo-UK Strategic Futures meeting, right? Yes. Where Mr. Jaishankar said that, listen, you can't tell us not to buy oil, deeply discounted oil from Russia, when half of Europe is buying so much oil to the equivalent of $1 billion every day. So what's the answer to that?
The answer is the same message is going out to Germany, right? This exact same message is going out to Germany and Italy and Spain and other southern European purchasers of Russian oil, who of course have the exact same dilemma, which is to say that if they divest themselves of Russian gas and oil, they will also be taking a severe economic hit, a much bigger economic hit than India. And Dr. Jaishankar is basically correct, but I think that isn't contradictory to the messaging that's coming out. The same message from the US, from the UK, from others is going to our friends, our partners in Europe, to say, we understand an oil and gas embargo.
Your partners are not clearly listening to you. The Germans aren't listening to you. They may be.
They very much are. Just because we haven't seen a full-scale oil embargo on Russia doesn't mean there aren't very significant changes going on in the energy politics of Europe, right? We're seeing all of these countries begin to try and diversify their sources, limit their energy usage. They are preparing for the possibility that they may need to cut some of these supplies, even if it's a very painful decision to make for them as well.
Zorawar, Shashank has a good point, which is that Europe is so dependent on Russian oil and gas that it's going to take it some time to diversify. But that doesn't mean that that's not happening. Now, on the other hand, if India and Russia are going to return to a ruble-rupee trade mechanism, which is in a sense going back to the past, how is this going to? How is India, for example, going to then deal with countries like the US, and sanctions will then kick in where Indian companies are concerned?
No, but I don't see why they're related. The whole point is, if you have bilateral partnerships with so many different players, you will choose at some point to transact directly in local currency, especially when the so-called reserve currencies have become hostage to domestic politics, weaponization, and all kinds of destabilizing actions that the West is taking in response to the Russian intervention. So I think what the Indian view has been that, in fact, we should step back and see what's happening. The United States for the last 3 decades has pursued which is obviously a failed Russia policy, unsustainable security architecture in Europe.
No, so Robert, all that's fine. But let's talk about.
I haven't understood why India should have to pay the costs of what's gone wrong there. And
India is not paying the cost. India has a.
No, it's being asked to sort of abide by sanctions that should only apply to states that have voluntarily participated in the US approach. And I don't think now, yes, it's possible that the United States could engage in secondary sanctions and start actually targeting Indian entities that are engaging with trade with Russia in all kinds of relationships. But that would then be an unfriendly act by a strategic partner, and that would also have consequences, right? So are they willing to then disrupt and bring Indo-US ties backwards? That's also a choice to be made, isn't it?
No, but Tanvi, can I ask you, Tanvi, I'd like to ask you the sanctions question. Now, the US and its allies have imposed sanctions on Russia. These are not UN sanctions. These are US-led sanctions. Why should you expect, other countries like India to follow these sanctions?
Well, I haven't imposed them, so I don't know why I should expect.
No. Listen, the Americans have imposed them. I know you haven't. You're a US analyst. You're sitting in DC, and so we're asking you to explain.
Yeah, but why
should India follow these US-led sanctions?
Look, it's India's choice, right? And the point I was about to make is, at the end of the day, the governments can talk about and find mechanisms, and governments will. India has tried to do this with Iran as well. But at the end of the day, so much in the economic and energy realm does not take place amongst governments. It's companies who are going to make a lot of decisions. So there will be some decisions that will be G2G, including between the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, and the Russians on kind of these rupee ruble schemes, which, as you know, Jyoti, have existed in the past. These are not new. I think some of the kind of commentary on this has also been, including in the West, somewhat overwrought in the sense of these are new mechanisms. They're not. They've existed before. But there are challenges regardless of actually implementing some of these alternate payment schemes. And yes, it is a constraint. I mean, India has said this for the longest time, right? That sanctions on others impose constraints. Similarly,
you recognize this as hypocrisy. Is that on the one hand, you keep talking about the UN, but in this particular case, you have...
I'm talking about
I'm saying the US, I keep saying you're not, it's not you, of course, Tanvi Madan, but the US has...
I've written an entire book on saying that, look, this is a constraint that India has had this concern about unreliability, and that's why, including having faced sanctions itself. Absolutely. So I only speak for myself, Jyoti. I can't speak for the United States and whether it recognizes these things. But clearly, this is partly what got lost in that there will be consequences, is that there is a recognition in the US that it does not want its partners affected by sanctions. There is a reason, for example, they have not imposed sanctions on oil purchases. The US has unilaterally said it's going to reduce, but because of Germany, because of other countries, including Japan and India, who kind of import oil, and it's not just from Russia, right? This is an increase in prices. So it affects everybody. And so it's not just a question of India being affected. In fact, there are others who are even more affected. So I don't think there's a lack of recognition. There's a huge debate in the US. Shashank could talk about it, whether in the UK, about overdoing sanctions as well, because you end up damaging, when you overuse a sanction, you will push countries towards alternative payment schemes or alternative currencies. Geeta Gopinath, for example, said that the other day as well. There is a danger. So I think there is a recognition. There's a huge debate about sanctions, about weaponizing interdependence. But let's also be clear. India has imposed sanctions and restrictions as well, right, on countries. That's what happened in the last 2 years with China. Now, those very restrictions that India imposed on China...
India did, whatever India has done with China is because Chinese troops are on Indian territory at the line of actual control.
Look, that's what I'm saying. When countries think that their own interests are being affected, they do these things. And those restrictions have inadvertently also affected various French, Japanese, and other companies and projects. They weren't meant to, but I'm just saying it's obviously not the same because India doesn't have the kind of dominance. And absolutely, I think this case of weaponizing interdependence and pushing countries towards kind of alternative payment schemes, absolutely something that's recognized. I think the damage to kind of, partnerships and alliances potentially is also recognized. But I will also say that, let's be realistic about this thing about creating alternative payment schemes And when those are done, that they're not kind of an open-ended way of dealing with these things, because private sectors are still have the exposure to the West that you want to do business. Even Indian public sector companies have exposure.
Obviously, I think absolutely that's a fair point, that Indian companies have huge exposure, much more exposure to the West. I mean, India's trade with the US is 10 times that with Russia. But Shashank, I know you have to go, but before you do that, the question to you is the question of sanctions. Is this recognized in London? You're a commercial capital. And do you recognize, when I say you, obviously, does the UK recognize that sanctions are an unfair weapon, especially in this particular case? It's the UK plus its allies, the US, etc., imposing sanctions on Russia. These are not UN-led sanctions, but countries are imposing sanctions.
What I would say is that debate is playing out amongst allies in a very sharp way. You can see it playing out amongst the debate on Nord Stream 2 in the United States and the cost that would impose on Germany. You can see it playing out in the debate on SWIFT, where a subset of European allies were much more concerned about the impact that a SWIFT cutoff for Russia might have. You can see it playing out on embargoes of consumer goods and trade restrictions, which would have affected some European economies much more than they would have affected us in the UK. For the UK and the US to impose oil restrictions is one thing. Of course, it's much more costly in Europe. So the debate we are having is a sort of is a microcosm of a much more intense debate that we're having amongst allies in Europe.
Is that hypocritical? No, would you say that it's hypocritical of Western nations to impose sanctions on Russia, for example? And in the UK, you've sort of seen assets of all these so-called Russian oligarchs have been sealed. Now, that again is a weapon that may or may not work.
Yeah.
What would you say that this is hypocrisy?
It's hypocrisy if we are telling others to divest themselves of Russia, but we're not putting our own house in order, I think, absolutely. And the UK, there is plenty to criticize the UK on that front. For many, many years, I and others have been saying that. I would say we're now at a moment where serious, substantial action is being taken in sanctioning the source of kleptocratic wealth in London, but it hasn't gone far enough. And I will always be very critical of this government and any British government for not doing enough, whether that's shadowy companies in the Cayman Islands, in offshore British companies. This issue of corruption and black wealth from authoritarian systems, and it isn't just Russia, is a problem that we have allowed to fester, and it is absolutely something we have to fix. And if we don't fix it, it is hypocritical to ask other countries to do it if we can't do it ourselves.
Zorawar, the question to you is that will the Russia invasion of Ukraine, which is in its fifth week, how do you think this is going to change India's foreign policy vis-a-vis the US, vis-a-vis Russia, and the rest of Europe?
So I think this crisis has really, in a sense, vindicated the core tenets of India's foreign policy, which is that we are not going to join a particular hierarchical block system, but we're going to maintain relationships, some of them unstable, some of them competitive, some of them positive, with a whole range of actors in what is now slowly and gradually becoming a multipolar world order. So I think, if anything, if anybody makes the argument that this crisis has upended India's foreign policy, well, they were then imagining India's foreign policy to be a Western sentinel or a frontline state in Asia and Eurasia, which is certainly not how Indians look at where they're going to play a role in this Indo-Pacific.
Jyoti, can I add one thing? Could I add one thing to that, please?
Yes.
One thing that interests me, one of the unknowns for me is, and I'm curious as to the views of the others, is this question of how this war and crisis is impacting Russia-China ties. And to my mind,
that was my next question.
It looks like what I see is quite a substantial and meaningful deepening, both before the outbreak of the war in the form of the joint statement and subsequently as well. And that has bigger picture implications for all of us, but it has also specific implications for India in terms of the pressures and incentives it creates in Moscow and how that then knocks on India down the line in the future. That's a big unknown, but I'm curious as to whether that creates serious challenges for Indian foreign policy in ways that are much bigger than...
That's a fair question. And Zorawar, can I ask you to answer it? Because this is also what Daleep Singh said, which is that next time the Chinese come to India's doors on the line of actual control, you don't expect the Russians to defend them.
Yeah, so the Russia-China relationship, of course, normalized 3 decades ago, and it's been growing rapidly since then. And I think what we're seeing now is, will the Russia backlash to NATO, start changing Russian security policies in the Indo-Pacific. If that were to happen, then of course the United States and its allies in East Asia will face a very different security environment. But as far as South Asia is concerned, the subcontinent, I think in that situation, given our bilateral relationship and partnership with Russia, I think we've always seen that when it comes to our core security interests, they've taken a sense of responsibility and sensitivity to our interests.
The question
we can't hypothesize. I mean, in fact, I would actually add and widen the spectrum, right? You look at the US outreach to China in the last month during this conflict. Biden has been reassuring Xi Jinping on matters of vital core security interests for China, in a sense. So I would say that's another challenge to look out for. Will US-China ties, which we were hypothesizing or anticipating would enter a new Cold War or competition, might just now be a little more stable with this competition playing out with interdependence? How does that play out for India's foreign policy, right? Okay. So there are going to be challenges on both sides.
Right. I need two questions to you. The first is, does India's sort of newfound friendship with Russia... Shashank, just hold 1 second. I know you have to go, but two questions to Tanvi before I let you go. Does India's newfound relationship with Russia affect its standing in the Quad? That's the first question. And the second question is about the US-China, Biden reaching out to Xi Jinping, as Zorawar just mentioned. What do you make of both?
So just on the latter, I wouldn't take the Chinese readouts of meetings as the final word, as we've seen this even with the readouts of Wang Yi's meetings with both National Security Advisor Doval and External Affairs Minister Jaishankar. They have their own version of events that is not usually reflective of what actually happened in the meeting. If you ask anybody here, the idea that there's going to be a G2 is actually the opposite of where people are. If anything, you've seen US-China, kind of China's position create real concerns, and you've had even people who had been calling not for a G2, but for stabilizing US-China relations, say China experts here who are saying this is a turning point. The fact that China is not just aligning with Russia diplomatically, but putting out the same statements, echoing its views, and the fact that, Wang Yi was in India partly to create diplomatic space because he's feeling pressure and China's feeling pressure from the West. So I don't think you're going to see, I think there was an attempt. I would watch very closely the EU-China summit today, which is going on, and what China takes away, because I actually think China will be more sensitive to something the Europeans say than the US, because they've just factored in that the US is now going to be its competitor. So I think this idea, yes, there are always concerns about a G2 in India and an A2 here, that, when Wang Yi went, that there's going to be some rapprochement. I just think, the trends are just not in that direction in either way. On the Quad, I would just say that, I think you can look at it both ways. I mean, there were two Quad meetings this week. There was one last week, and these are kind of at the level of actually implementing a lot of things. There's still going to be a leaders summit. So I think there are two ways of looking at this. One, you could actually say that, yes, this has raised some concerns amongst Quad countries that what will India do? Nobody expected India, the Quad to be active in Europe or thinking about that. You could say that, this has raised concerns in some Quad countries. What will India do in an Indo-Pacific contingency? Forget anything to do with Europe. Having said that, what you've already seen, and New Delhi's concerns about these theaters being linked, right, and getting expansive. But I think there are two things to keep in mind. One, you've actually seen the Quad become a platform to discuss differences. And I think that's something we need to kind of go back to. Nobody said that all these countries are going to agree on everything. It's about how you manage differences. And the Russia-India difference or the relationship is not newfound, right? It's been around for ages. I think this was factored in that there are differences on this. I think the second, very quickly, the second aspect is that I think there's going to be kind of all sides needing to reconcile some kind of realities or contradictions even. I think for the other Quad member states, the very role that they want India to play, especially in balancing China, whether it's holding the line at the border, whether it's in maritime security, depends on Russian capabilities right now. I think that's a reality, and it is the case for a while. But I think on the other hand, India is going to have to figure out, just one final thing, India is going to have to figure out when you say we're going to align with like-minded countries to balance China, and India has said, but we will not align with those countries to isolate Russia. The challenge now is that Russia and China are increasing their alignment. The question is, how far does it go? And I know there's a debate in India on this and the potential implications, but I think that we'll see play out. And we'll get signs of it one way or the other.
Right.
But clearly people are thinking about this in Delhi, and it is not a hypothetical. In 1962, the Soviets did help.
Shashank, can I ask you to come in here? What do you think? How do you think the Russia, China, India story is going to play out?
I have very little to add to what Tanvi's already said. I think it does depend, of course, on, we have seen things like joint bomber patrols in the Indo-Pacific. So we have seen kind of embryonic signs of potential cooperative
activity. But the question is I'm sorry to put it so bluntly and perhaps in black and white terms, but is China, the US's sort of, is China the primary antagonist, or is it Russia?
Well, look, anyone who has anything longer than a 5-minute conversation with anyone in the Department of Defense in the last 5 years at any level will understand the profound incentives, professional, intellectual, strategic, set by the administration in clear terms, to focus overwhelmingly on China. And while, of course, Europe is the intense focus right now, and of course, while we heard the European commander, EUCOM commander, ask that more resources should stay in Europe last week, that is what competent commanders in the US Armed Forces do. It is not the view of most of the DoD establishment. I say this as a European who has obvious interests in wanting the US to stick around in large numbers and shield us in Eastern Europe. So, obviously, it is in our interest to have that. But we recognize absolutely the US is the overriding concern. I've been going to the US every year for several years, and it's strikingly clear to me that across administrations, across different intellectual cultures, it is very, very clear that is the shift that we're seeing.
But the EU trade, or European Union's trade with China, went up by over 25% last year, and this is a pandemic year. So it's watch the signs. $800 billion. Watch the signs of the EU-China summits coming up imminently. Watch the signs out of that. Look at the run-up to that, how difficult that's been. The EU-China relationship is in an incredibly bad place for various reasons, to do with Lithuania, to do with sanctions on the EU. It's in a really rough place, and it's changed beyond recognition in the last 3 years. But of course, the EU is not the main strategic actor in this context. So Zorawar, it's quite interesting that Shashank believes that the EU-China relationship is in a bad place. The bilateral trade is more than $800 billion. It's gone up by more than 25%. The US-China economic relationship.
And Jyoti, sorry, this time I really do have to run, but I will catch up on Zorawar's no doubt perceptive answer very shortly afterwards.
Okay, thanks again. Thank you for joining us. Last couple of questions to the two of you. Zorawar, to you. On the US-China trade relationship as well as the EU-China trade relationship, both have increased manifold in this last year. How do you see it?
Yeah, so Jyoti, I think that level of interdependence, which has been built up over so many years with so many different actors, organic, state level, people to people, I don't think it's going to be reversed. And I don't think there's an intent in Europe or the United States to completely erase that interdependence. All the signs that we are seeing, let's look at it at face value. China, after this crisis, has taken a notch down in terms of this extreme competition, the way Biden had defined it a year ago. He had said, let's expect this to be the next big thing. I think it's clear Russia is the enemy now. China is a competitor, not an enemy yet. And I think we should also, sitting in Delhi, recognize that US-China relations are going to be complicated and complex, just as India-China relations are. And they are not going to completely abandon or upset, because destabilizing Sino-American relations will completely unravel America's posture in the Pacific. And then they're left with practically nothing. So I think, and frankly, from an Indian perspective, I think we would have liked them to find some sort of a post-war settlement in Eastern Europe that allows for at least a Eurasia that's going to be this diversified, multipolar. But what they're really promoting is a Sino-Russian sort of consolidation, which frankly will not happen for reasons that are unrelated to the United States. The Russians and the Chinese have their own ambitions, their own manifest destinies, and they will cooperate, but they will
but
also
this is certainly worrying
to each other. So, and I think if you look at Russia's foreign policy with every single neighbor of China's, they have very deep security relations with Vietnam, with India, with North Korea. They will continue to develop those. They are not going to let China have a veto on what they see are they're big players now. So I think we should be confident enough to recognize this multipolar world has its complexities, but also opportunities for India's foreign policy.
So Tanvi, what I think worries a lot of people in Delhi is that the India-Russia trade relationship at the end of the day is less than $10 billion. You know, the India-US trade relationship is, 10 times more that, and there is talk of a trade deal finally being signed between the two countries. But my question to you is that, when Daleep Singh says that when the Chinese come and sit on the line of actual control again, the Russians are not going to bail you out. But the fact is that that Russian arms are bailing out Indian soldiers on the LAC. You're a China hand, you know that.
So I actually think, I don't think this is about what Daleep Singh said, right? India has watched this, looking at the China-Soviet or China-Russia relationship is not new to India. Many people in general have started looking at this since the February 4th statement. India has thought about this since at least the 1950s, if not earlier. Why? Because for India, whenever, especially once India started to see China as a rival or adversary, when China-Soviet or China-Russia ties have been close, while yes, it might create a few opportunities in terms of RIC and BRICS, strategically, it has been problematic for India. This is not news to India. Why has been in India's interest to try to keep the China-Russia relationship from deepening? Because it starts to affect strategic and security interests, because the question rises in people's minds, which I think Pranab Dhal Samanta put the other day in an article, which is what would a Russia that is more beholden to China as a result of this crisis, what will they do if, for example, China makes asks or demands of Russia that are not in Indian interest? Now, we've already seen over the last few years, Russia has been less helpful to India at the UN Security Council and has tended to align with China and sometimes with China and Pakistan. So the question is not an abstract one for Indian policymakers. And look, I think this is not new. So I think the question is, what do you do about it? There have been two schools of thought, right? Sometimes they're actually compatible. One, over time, reduce overdependence on Russia for military supplies, especially by producing at home, and to some extent by diversifying with a wide variety of actors, not wanting to replace overdependence on Russia with overdependence on the US. So this is where France and Israel and others come in as well. Second, at the same time, one of the arguments India has made, for example, to keep a non-China option open for Russia to continue to maintain that relationship is to give it those options. There is this hope that there will be that Russia, even if it continues to get closer to China, that it will not make choices against India. Now, that is something I think, depending on the duration and outcome of this crisis, we'll see that proposition will be tested. But I will say that I think, the idea of a Sino-Russian split, there are differences between the two countries, as Zorawar said, but the thing is timing matters. So I'll just end with kind of Prime Minister Nehru, at his first meeting with an American president in 1949, said, China and Russia or Soviet Union will split. Now, he was right, but it took another 10, 15 years for that to happen, 15 years. And that affected Indian interests because the Soviet Union at a crucial moment did take China's side. So he wasn't wrong, but it's about timing. So I think the split will happen maybe 10, 15 years from now. Right now, that's not the case. And you have Sergei Lavrov saying the day before he comes to India that China-Russia relations have never been better and they are our closest partners. So
they are their closest. China is Russia's closest partner because they're so dependent on them for all kinds of, whether it's trade, commodities or arms or gas. But Zorawar, the last question to you is, India is certainly holding its nose and has been for the last 5 weeks since the Russians invaded Ukraine. I ask this question a lot, which is that while it is in India's interest to watch what's going on and abstain time and again at the UN Security Council, at the Human Rights Council, at the UNGA, etc. But India is deeply disturbed by the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, isn't it? Or Indians are deeply disturbed.
You've seen the entire continent of Europe, in a sense, destabilized, right? But I think Indians have recognized that this is not their fight. They didn't cause it. And for whatever it's worth, I think India, given how it's approached its periphery in the past, it can even understand when you have external powers build up alliances that are hostile to the main regional power, can have a reaction. This is, of course, a violent reaction. We would have hoped that US and NATO and Russians would have arrived at a diplomatic settlement a month ago, 2 months ago. They had the opportunity. Sadly, now we're at a stage where force will dictate and see where the settlement arises. I think when the dust settles, we would hope that Western Europe, the Germans, the French, can play a moderating role in how Washington looks at this entire Eurasian landscape. Because I seriously feel false moves now by Western policymakers will accelerate the world which they were trying to prevent. And I think India will have no choice but to look at these events and participate in this new world order while also having a stake in deep ties with the West. So it is going to be a complex, multi-dimensional, multi-vector foreign policy, whatever you want to call it. But the multipolar world is going to accelerate by the American reaction to the Russian intervention.
Okay. And Tanvi, I can't but return to Daleep Singh. I mean, his completely tone-deaf remarks in Delhi have astounded everyone. I mean, I'm not sure that any American diplomat has been as sort of completely out of sync, at least not since the nuclear tests, which is, more than 20 years ago, since 1998. But does it rankle that Prime Minister Modi met Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and did not meet these other world leaders? Does it matter in other capitals? I
don't think it matters, right? I mean, prime ministers don't meet deputy national security advisors.
No, not Daleep Singh. Certainly not especially after what he said. But
look, can I tell you something? I actually think we're exaggerating. I mean, we like to exaggerate. There have been, as you know, a few kind of incidents that have been more serious since 1998, including the infamous K-Gate. Let's not go into that were more concern. So I actually think this is going to be a storm in the teacup at the end of it. Another moment, we've seen this now, as Vijay Gokhale, former foreign secretary, said yesterday or day before, the trajectory of the US-India relationship of the last 20 years is in one direction. And there have been such episodes. But I think let's not exaggerate, what one person said. To me, actually, what was more interesting, which got lost, is I was interested to see that what his message was within, the broader journalist roundtable is saying, we are finding ways to help India out to ensure it can get its energy and food security needs, etc., taken care of. And I also say, it's not about India can actually play a role, for example, on the food security side, because of wheat surpluses, etc., helping out Indian partners in Africa in particular, Middle East, etc. Even energy security. India has ties with the Saudis and UAE that can be helpful in this regard. So I actually think, there's certain things we know. India is not going to condemn Russia by name. To me, the focus should be, okay, how can the countries ensure that you get back to dialogue? Nobody's interested in kind of this war continuing. But I will say two things just kind of on the point you asked, Zorawar. I think at the end of the day, the reason the prime minister and the foreign minister have said they're concerned about the international order being destabilized by a use of force to change territorial integrity and sovereignties, India has no interest in the fact being accepted that it's okay for a larger neighbor to violate the territorial integrity.
Yeah, I think Tanvi makes a fair point, which is that India is not, and India and Dr. Jaishankar has said that time and again. That India
and the Prime Minister did, to BIMSTEC as well.
That India does not want to see maps being changed and that, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of nations being violated.
Naturally, right? I mean, the UN Charter spells out territorial sovereignty and integrity as a core foundation but it's also about having a approach to a security architecture that is responsible. I think the West has been completely irresponsible in the way it's managed European security for the last 3 decades, and particularly since 2014. So let's see it in that context. And I don't see what's happening in Europe linked with how China and India operate. We have our own dynamics.
The foreign minister linked it.
We have a line of actual control which is militarized, and I think both sides have, despite even a brief interludes of conflict, managed it quite responsibly, and I think they will do so. So I don't think we should interlink what's happening there with what's happening on the India-China.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there, but I have to say that Daleep Singh's remarks, I think, in a sense, encapsulated the mood in Delhi, which is that, we are willing to talk to anybody under the sun, whoever comes to Delhi, and there have been several leaders coming here these last several days. But to tell somebody off or to tell the Indian government off was somewhat unacceptable. But Tanvi Madan in Washington, D.C., Zorawar, Daulet Singh in New Delhi, thank you both so much for joining me on the print debate.
Thanks, Jyoti.
Thank you.